What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China. I originally started putting these videos together for my mates back home. They said you should throw that stuff up on YouTube, and people have been following ever since. So if you're interested in following China, maybe consider subscribing. I throw one of these up on YouTube about once a week. For everybody else, it's great to see you as always. I look forward to your comments regarding my analysis on this episode. Same thing as always, if you're interested in a specific story, you'll see them in the description. I've got them in chapters, you can just hit that. Or if you want to watch the whole thing, sit back and we can go through it now. And as always, because I'm producing this in China, I put it up on a VPN. The YouTube algorithm really does not like that. So the best thing you can do to help me out is smash that like button if you enjoy the video. It tells the YouTube algorithm this content creator is legitimate and he is not a bot from the Chinese government within China. Now, with all that said, let's jump into this week's China Update. Okay guys, let's start with the economy. Last week we were discussing the shrinkage in the economy. The first time since the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese economy has shrunk. The official number that was published by the Chinese Bureau of Statistics was 6.8%. Like I said at that time, this number could be accurate, but it could well also be much higher. For example, Derek Scissors, who is a China expert and an economist and somebody I have a lot of time for with the American Enterprise Institute, said in a recent piece that he believes that the economy likely shrank by up to 16%. What we have to remember is that over the last few months, General Secretary Xi Jinping has been fighting a people's war, is the language that has been used, and he has said from the beginning that the local officials all across China have to achieve dual policy objectives. That is, controlling the spread of the virus, the pandemic, the epidemic, and 2, getting people back to work. From February, I've been talking to you guys about this idea of this dual policy requirement on governments all across the country and how it's really nightmarish. Basically, you're trying to get social distancing and you're trying to get people in a place where they're not spreading this disease, while also getting economic activity back up and running and keeping people in work. It's a very, very difficult balancing trick. But basically what this does, this incredible pressure does at the local level, is create an incentive for local officials to produce information and data to hand to their superiors that suggests 1, the epidemic is under control, and 2, economic activity is coming back to that part of the country. This then goes up to that person's superior and then up to another superior, all through the system in this hierarchy until the data reaches, in terms of GDP information, the National Bureau of Statistics in Beijing, which also has its own incentives and constraints. It is with that in mind that we have to think about the numbers that come out of that bureau when it comes to economic performance, as well as other numbers like, for example, the official tally of people that have caught the virus. Okay, so last Friday, a week ago, not just yesterday, the Politburo Standing Committee had a meeting in Beijing where they published the 6 ensures, the Liu Bao. These 6 ensures included 1, ensure employment, 2, basic livelihoods, 3, market entities, 4, food and energy security, 5, the stability of the supply chain, and 6, functioning of grassroots institutions. Now notice that none of these ensures included GDP performance, like reaching a GDP number, despite the fact that they did have an official tally before the pandemic, or official goal before the pandemic outbreak. And the first of these ensures is employment. And those of you who have been watching this and know for the last few weeks, I've been talking about how important avoiding mass unemployment has been to the party, more so than reaching a specific growth target. Now, these 6 ensures also exist with the older 6 stabilities, or Liuwen, which has existed for a few years, and these are stable employment, stable finance, stable foreign trade, stable foreign investment, and stable expectations. So what do they mean by these Liubao and Liuwen, these 6 ensures and these 6 stabilities? Well, on Thursday, the state-run CCTV said, 稳是大局，保卫底线. or stability is the overall picture, and ensure is the bottom line. General Secretary Xi Jinping stressed the need to implement the 6 ensures and the 6 stabilities when he was performing a special tour of Shanxi province this week. At that same Politburo meeting last Friday, there was an official statement that also expressed the government will adopt a proactive fiscal policy, increase the deficit to GDP ratio, so allowing the government officially to borrow more money and spend it with a deficit, issue special government bonds to combat the epidemic, and increase the number of local government bonds. Now, on that theme of government revenue and spending, on Monday, China's Ministry of Finance said that it would make another early allocation of 2020 special purpose bond quotas worth over 1 trillion RMB, which is about 140 billion US dollars, to local governments. This is in addition to 1.29 trillion RMB of special purpose bonds already approved. Those of you who have been watching the show know that this is the 3rd time a special allocation of bonds has gone forward. Actually, local governments last year, before the epidemic, were already using 2020 government financing bonds or special financing bonds to meet the revenue obligations in late 2019. So this is again another early allocation of future bond allowances for local governments. On the question on the topic of revenue, the same report last week from the National Bureau of Statistics, which discussed the GDP economic performance, also discussed local government revenue and expenditure levels, and it found officially that China's fiscal revenue, or government fiscal revenue, fell approximately 15% in the first quarter. Okay, so let's move from the party to the government. On Tuesday, the State Council had a meeting where Premier Li Keqiang announced that the government would, for the first time, extend unemployment benefits and other forms of emergency aid to migrant workers for the first time. Migrant workers number in the hundreds of millions and have historically not benefited from some of these unemployment benefits. In the same meeting, Premier Li called for the state infrastructure projects to hire more migrant workers and recent graduates. This is another theme that we've been discussing, the idea of avoiding mass unemployment for specifically migrant workers and college graduates, which can potentially be turned into political issues if it's not managed correctly. And we've also discussed 2 weeks ago my thoughts as to the expansion of the state in this economic crisis, what that means for employment over the next few years, and the role and what it will mean for the private sector going forward. So 2 weeks ago, if you're interested in my thoughts on the expansion of the state sector, the expansion of the state in the economy in China, that's from 2 weeks ago as well. On Wednesday, the National Development and Reform Commission announced that in order to stimulate the economy, China is going to speed up the development of quote-unquote new infrastructure. The idea being to provide technical support for the transformation of urban infrastructure with the use of 5G communications, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, industrial internet, and other emerging technologies. In fact, promoting smart city growth was a key political task before the epidemic, and this has just put that trajectory on steroids. There is a difference, however, between bringing forward an infrastructure project, a traditional infrastructure project like a bridge, for example, that was due to be built in 7 years, and building it now in order to get some boost in economic performance, and bringing forward an infrastructure project that relies on a technology that is still developing and may be several years away. So the fact that a central ministry or a central commission is saying that this can be brought forward doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be implemented correctly the way that they're claiming it can be here. Before we move on to the next part of the video, I think it's worth bringing up something that I've seen a lot in Western media and Western opinions this week. There's been a lot of opinions discussing the fact that Western observers are over-exaggerating the role of exports in the Chinese growth model. Basically, the idea that people are over-exaggerating how important exports are, and that China can actually see growth through its own domestic consumption. It has a large market and it's no longer an export-led economy anymore. Now, I agree with some of this. I do agree that it has been a mischaracterization for over a decade now to say that the Chinese growth model was export driven, but exports do remain an important part of its growth model, though it is not the largest driver like it was before 08 and 09. It still represents, like I've said many times before on this show, 20% of GDP. And 20% of GDP is not a small amount. It's true that we should not view China as an export-led economy anymore, but we should still recognize that exports do represent a large part of its economic growth engine and a large part of the demand that it needs to see in order to maintain steady growth. The current environment, the current international environment, both politically and economically, is going to make things difficult for the Chinese, though it will not be as dangerous as it was before 08 and 09, when it was the largest driver of the economy. And in regards to that 20%, it's useful for comparative purposes to look at the United States, where you see that international trade or exports outside of the NAFTA, the North American Agreement, only represents about 5% of American growth annually. Okay, next up, let's talk about Hong Kong, because it's actually been a pretty important week in Hong Kong for those who are interested in what happens in the Special Administrative Region. Last weekend, 15 activists were rounded up on suspicion of, quote, organizing, publicizing, or taking part in several unauthorized assemblies between August and October, and will face prosecution, unquote, according to Hong Kong police. Now, these were not small fish. They were actually very large figures in the broad pan-democratic movement in Hong Kong, including lawmakers, lawyers, politicians, and a media tycoon. Now, the day before the arrest, the central government's liaison office in Hong Kong declared that it is not subject to the Basic Law Article 22 restrictions that bar central government departments from interfering with local affairs in Hong Kong. Now remember, the Basic Law is the mini constitution of Hong Kong, which is a constitutional pillar in the overall one country, two systems framework that allows Hong Kong a relatively high level of autonomy as a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. 3 days after that announcement, on Monday this week, the Hong Kong Bar Association said in a statement that the public was deeply uneased by the position that was made and the statements that were made by the liaison office, and that it is, quote, plainly inconsistent, unquote, with established precedents. The following day, on Tuesday, the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office in Beijing stated that it, quote, fully supported, unquote, the arrests of the activists over the weekend, and accused the figures of being involved in, quote, extreme violence, unquote, and that the central government enjoyed the right to, quote, maintain the constitutional order, unquote, in Hong Kong. Now, a well-respected Hong Kong legal scholar, Jerome Cohen, wrote an opinion this week discussing the arrests, and I think some of his opinions are worth quoting at length. He said that the moves over the weekend, quote, may well be an attempt by Beijing to provoke a broad popular reaction, and will then provide an excuse not only to finally bulldoze success passing controversial national security legislation in Hong Kong under Basic Law Article 23, but also to call off the critical September election scheduled for Hong Kong's Legislative Council, end quote. In a statement, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs said the exercise of Chinese state power in Hong Kong is fully legal and should not be distorted to mean interference by the international community. Now, these arrests, and in particular the debate around these issues of the Basic Law in Hong Kong, are incredibly controversial. They are more controversial and more likely to provoke people within Hong Kong than the proposed extradition laws from last year, which sparked widespread protest movements through most of the latter half of 2019. I fear that the streets of Hong Kong will see far more blood this year than they did in 2019. Now, quickly, let's have a quick update about the outbreak situation in China. It is still not under control. There is still the risk of imported cases, asymptomatic individuals, as well as clusters of outbreaks that are appearing all across the country, particularly in the north and in major border and airport cities. So there are cases all over the country popping up, including Beijing, Chaoyang district, which is a major district in Beijing, the capital. There are several dozen official new cases every day, mostly from Chinese citizens returning from overseas. 2 hospitals in Harbin, the provincial capital of Heilongjiang in the northeast, have been quarantined, and the city is in a state of semi-lockdown. The local officials in that provincial capital also reprimanded earlier this week by the provincial leadership of Heilongjiang. In fact, the situation in that city is becoming increasingly serious, and that lockdown may become more intense. If the outbreak cannot be taken under control, you may see a Wuhan level of quarantine and lockdown in that city in the northeast. We're not quite there yet. If we do get to that level, I will update you guys there. Now, the northeast part of the country and Inner Mongolia is a particular challenge to the Chinese government because they have very long land borders. With the Russian side, there are many Chinese citizens who are trying to get back into China, and they are bringing large numbers of positive individuals who then risk contagion or outbreaks when they come across the border. The Chinese have temporarily closed down several major land borders, including one that is close to the Russian city of Vladivostok. Now, when we're on this subject of the risk of carriers coming across the land borders, particularly in the northeast, there is another wild card that has potentially come up. I'm sure people who are watching this are aware that there have been reports about the health of the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. In the event of major destabilization in that country, for example, if their leader passed away, that could increase the numbers of refugees pouring over from the North Korean side into China, which shares a very long border with North Korea. That would be not only a disaster for the Chinese side in a typical time, but in the current era with the coronavirus globally, and with most experts believing that North Koreans are dealing with a pretty major outbreak within their country potentially, that would mean both a refugee crisis as well as a health crisis in that part of China. So this is something that the Chinese side are watching very, very closely, and they do not want a destabilizing event to happen in North Korea. This is something we need to keep an eye on. On a more positive side, it seems that there are parts of the country that are opening up, including my city here of Hangzhou, where I currently live. And it looks like over the next few weeks, kids are going to start going back to school, and young adults are going to start going back to their classes at university. So this is a relatively positive side, and it suggests that there are at least part of the countries where the local government believe that it's sufficiently safe to see these lockdowns being removed. Okay, we also need to talk about developments in the South China Sea that have occurred over the last week or so. Over the last weekend, China said that it has also established an administrative district over the Paracel Islands, or the Xisha Dao, and another on the Spratly Islands, Nansha Dao. 2 districts were placed under the administrative control of China's Sansha city government, which was established in 2012 on Woodley Island and has a population of approximately 1,500 people. This move was essentially to subdivide the city government into different administrative districts. The problem is that the Paracel Islands are also claimed by Vietnam, and the Spratly Islands are claimed by Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. The problem also is that another administrative division, another district, the Zhongsha Dao, or the Zhongsha Islands, are not actually over islands. They're not even features. In fact, it's over a part of the ocean that just has a very shallow sea. But by calling this area or this district one that is controlled over islands, Chinese say that they can claim territory as well as an exclusive economic zone. Now, in response to the demarcation of these new administrative districts over the weekend, Vietnam made a complaint with Beijing on Monday. The following day, Chinese Foreign Ministry said, quote, "Vietnam's legal claims in the South China Sea are doomed to fail." Now, this development over the last week should be seen in the context of a spike in naval incidents over the last few months with Japan, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Now, lastly and quickly, let's have a quick update regarding China's diplomatic efforts and the pushing of its narrative internationally. Over the last few weeks, I've discuss with you guys particular diplomatic incidents that China has had with countries not just in the West, but also in Asia and in the developing world. Despite its big aid push, its donation of medical and protective equipment all around the world, and its strong narrative that it's pushed internationally, it doesn't seem like its diplomatic efforts and the narrative it's trying to push, which we have discussed in previous episodes, is working particularly well with some countries. This week, the United States, Germany, and Australia have all been calling for international investigations into the origin of the virus in China, as well as China's original performance in the first few months. France and the UK have both indicated that this question and investigation eventually does need to happen, but at the moment it is not the best time. The focus of the global community should be on the united fight against this pandemic. Internationally as well, over the last few weeks, relations, diplomatic and popular, have soured between China and major countries like Japan, Brazil, India, and several African trading partners. As I have discussed before, the relationship between China and the US is the worst that it has ever been since normalization in the 1970s. I believe that it is in free fall and that it will continue to deteriorate, that we're going to move into a new normal of highly aggressive China-US relations, which will be much more competitive in terms of economics and security concerns, but also in terms of information dissemination and PR efforts internationally. This political move within the US is also echoed with popular sentiment. It seems that China is now overwhelmingly unpopular amongst regular Americans. In fact, this week there was a report from the Pew Research Center that found that 9 in 10 Americans now view China as a threat, with 62% viewing China as a major threat. It is my view that the China-US relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world today, and I will be keeping a close eye on these developments and updating you guys here as they occur. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this week's China Update. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or if you have any comments, disagreements, whatever with my content and my analysis, please put those down below. I always enjoy hearing your guys' thoughts and answering your questions. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week on China Update.